Case 1, June 12, 2016, Orlando, Florida. A 29-year-old security guard opened fire inside Pulse nightclub during the early morning hours, sending patrons scrambling for cover as calls flooded emergency lines. Within days, investigators centered their attention on the shooter's documented instability and extremist claims, tracing the lead-up to the deadliest attack of its time and the chaos that unfolded in minutes. Police responded to an active shooter at 2:02 a.m., arriving to a scene where dozens were wounded, trapped, or hiding inside restrooms and storage areas. Initial gunfire was followed by a prolonged standoff as officers negotiated, evacuated survivors, and attempted to contain the situation. Evidence quickly indicated inconsistencies in the perpetrator's shifting statements during calls made inside the club, while tactical units assessed structural hazards that complicated immediate entry. The unfolding hours highlighted communication delays, uncertain victim locations, and the escalating danger as reports of continued shots intensified pressure on first responders. The attack struck late-night patrons gathered for weekend events, intersecting with LGBTQ nightlife spaces long targeted in broader hate-motivated rhetoric. Many visitors were local residents, while others were out-of-town attendees celebrating Latin night at the venue. Meanwhile, the shooter traveled from another city, reinforcing questions about premeditation and motive. Prior accounts of his behavioral instability, workplace problems, and violent remarks gained renewed relevance as investigators reconstructed his background, mapping personal grievances and ideological claims against the timeline of the attack. Law enforcement identified prior FBI investigations that had closed without charges, then verified his recent firearms purchases made legally weeks before the attack. Review of phone communications during the standoff revealed shifting ideological declarations and attempts to justify the violence. Detectives analyzed surveillance footage, 911 transcripts, and electronic data to determine whether outside coordination existed. Parallel inquiries reviewed his social media activity, workplace history, and family interviews for indicators missed in earlier assessments. SWAT teams breached the structure at approximately 5:15 a.m. after explosive entry was deemed the only viable option to reach remaining victims. The armed confrontation that followed resulted in the shooter's death, confirming his sole involvement and ending the hours-long crisis. Officers then began extracting survivors, marking and clearing rooms, and stabilizing the wounded while confirming that no additional suspects were present. Recovery operations continued through daylight as investigators processed the extensive crime scene. Federal scrutiny turned toward FBI vetting procedures, firearm purchase regulations, and lapses identified in earlier assessments of the shooter's behavior. Noor Salman, his wife, was prosecuted on accusations of prior knowledge but ultimately acquitted, a verdict that reignited debate over evidence standards and prosecutorial discretion. Victims' names, vigils, and memorial sites soon became central to national conversations on targeted mass violence, hate-motivated attacks, and systemic gaps exposed by the tragedy. Case 2, June 17, 2015, Charleston, South Carolina. 9 church members were killed during an evening Bible study session, and investigators quickly focused on a 21-year-old attendee who sat with the group before opening fire. As survivors provided initial descriptions and the suspect fled the scene, authorities moved rapidly to identify him, setting off a nationwide alert tied to one of the deadliest racially motivated attacks in recent U.S. history. A 911 call reported active gunfire inside Emmanuel AME Church, triggering an immediate response from local police and federal agencies as chaos unfolded within the historic sanctuary. Officers arriving on site found victims across multiple rooms, while bullet casings, survivor accounts, and emergency evacuation patterns pointed to deliberate targeting rather than random violence. Surveillance footage captured the suspect entering and leaving the building, accelerating the release of public images and fueling a multi-state manhunt. As investigators secured the perimeter and collected early forensic leads, federal partners joined the effort under the presumption of a hate-motivated mass killing. Victims included clergy members, community leaders, and longtime worshipers participating in routine midweek religious study, reflecting the church's cultural and historical role within Charleston's Black community. Attendees welcomed the unfamiliar young man into their circle before the attack, consistent with the congregation's long-standing openness to visitors. Meanwhile, Roof was an unemployed young man living in isolation and deeply immersed in online white supremacist material. His Gittle behavior, coupled with prior statements recalled by acquaintances, illustrated an escalating fixation on racial violence that contrasted starkly with the peaceful gathering he targeted. Digital evidence recovered from Roof's personal devices included a manifesto outlining racist ideology, images of Confederate iconography, and references to extremist forums. Investigators traced the firearm used in the attack to a recent purchase made possible by incomplete background check information, an administrative lapse later termed the Charleston loophole. Background checks, social media reviews, and interviews with family and associates reinforced the conclusion that the attack was premeditated and ideologically motivated. The detailed contents of his writings and online activity became central to both federal and state cases. Roof was apprehended during a traffic stop in North Carolina less than 24 hours after the shooting, following a tip that matched the vehicle description distributed nationwide. During questioning, he provided statements acknowledging his ideological motives and expressing no remorse, confirming investigators' early suspicions. His capture ended the manhunt, but initiated a complex legal process that further elevated the case into national focus. Authorities transported him back to Charleston under tight security as prosecutors prepared coordinated charges. Roof was federally convicted and sentenced to death on hate crime, obstruction, and firearm counts, while parallel state proceedings resulted in life sentences. The case intensified national debate over Confederate symbols, hate crime enforcement, and procedural failures within firearm background check systems. Emanuel AME Church became a central site for vigils, policy discussions, and memorial activity as the country confronted the violent implications of extremist ideology and systemic vulnerabilities highlighted by the attack. Case 3. 2015. New York. A pharmaceutical chief executive became widely known for dramatic drug price hikes, and soon federal scrutiny turned toward earlier financial misconduct allegations tied to his hedge fund operations. Public controversy surrounding his corporate decisions brought renewed attention to long-standing concerns raised by investors, analysts, and former colleagues, shifting the focus from drug pricing alone to a broader history of disputed financial practices. Daraprim price increases in 2015 triggered nationwide backlash as hospitals, clinicians, and patient advocacy organizations reported abrupt cost spikes that disrupted treatment access. The medication's price rose far beyond historical norms, prompting widespread condemnation and documentation of shortages affecting immunocompromised patients. Healthcare centers described delays in procurement, insurers issued emergency policy adjustments, and specialists warned of the impact on those reliant on consistent antiparasitic therapy. Media coverage amplified the reaction, framing the decision as emblematic of predatory pharmaceutical strategy and escalating pressure on regulators to examine Shkreli's broader business conduct. Patients dependent on the drug found themselves facing new levels of financial strain, as the sudden increases placed essential treatment out of reach for many without expanded insurance support. This public health concern intersected with Shkreli's earlier career trajectory, which included hedge fund management marked by aggressive trading decisions, high-risk investment strategies, and corporate acquisitions that sometimes led to disputes with investors. His transition into pharmaceutical leadership reflected a broader pattern of leveraging financial mechanisms to expand control over small to mid-sized firms, creating a business profile defined by rapid moves, controversy, and volatile stakeholder relations. The FBI intensified a separate probe into his hedge fund activities, uncovering evidence of misrepresented performance results, misleading investor statements, and the use of cross-company fund transfers to mask losses. Investigators identified a pattern in which certain investors were kept unaware of poorly performing assets, while funds from unrelated corporate entities were redirected to satisfy earlier obligations. This sequence of actions predated Shkreli's pharmaceutical notoriety, indicating that federal interest stemmed not from the price hike controversy itself, but from deeper structural concerns about fraudulent financial reporting and deceptive investment practices. Shkreli was arrested in December 2015 on securities fraud and conspiracy counts, marking the culmination of inquiries that consolidated whistleblower memoranda, financial audit findings, and testimony from investors who reported discrepancies in fund statements. Federal indictments outlined schemes in which returns were overstated, losses concealed, and corporate resources misallocated in ways inconsistent with securities regulations. His arrest shifted public discussion from pharmaceutical ethics to criminal allegations involving investor deception and misuse of capital. Convictions in 2017 resulted in a 7-year federal sentence, prohibitions on future participation in the pharmaceutical industry, and forfeiture orders covering millions in assets. The case contributed to renewed national debate surrounding drug pricing oversight, regulatory loopholes, and the intersection between corporate governance and public health. Policy discussions intensified in Congress and among advocacy groups, with Shkreli's actions referenced as a catalyst for examining systemic vulnerabilities in both financial reporting and pharmaceutical market regulation. Case 4. November 3, 2016, Spartanburg County, South Carolina. A missing persons inquiry culminated in the unexpected rescue of a captive woman found chained inside a locked shipping container. The discovery redirected investigators toward a local real estate agent whose outwardly successful business operations concealed a long pattern of violent crimes. As deputies expanded the search, early findings suggested that the unfolding case involved far more than a single disappearance. Authorities executed a targeted search on a rural property after digital records and witness accounts confirmed that a missing couple's final known movements traced back to the location. During the sweep, officers heard noises from inside a metal container and uncovered one victim alive, bound, and reporting prolonged captivity. Her statements revealed that her male companion had been murdered shortly after their disappearance, prompting an immediate shift from a recovery mission to a homicide investigation. Excavations and auxiliary searches on the extensive acreage continued as teams attempted to identify additional victims and reconstruct the timeline of the couple's abduction. Victims linked to the offender included motorcycle shop employees murdered in 2003, as well as individuals encountered through sporadic business dealings tied to real estate or local commerce. Despite these earlier crimes, Kohlhepp maintained a reputation as a reliable real estate professional, operating a successful brokerage, managing multiple properties, and interacting routinely with clients. This public persona stood in stark contrast to his concealed violent history, which included previous sex offense convictions and behavioral issues that had gone largely unnoticed by associates, enabling him to blend into his community while targeting victims with limited social visibility. Evidence recovered during property searches, including buried remains, weapon components, and ballistic residues, provided material connections to several unsolved cases. Firearm analyzes established matches between weapons in Kohlhepp's possession and shell casings recovered from the 2003 motorcycle shop quadruple homicide. As forensic teams processed multiple burial sites, investigators cross-checked missing persons reports with physical findings. Kohlhepp's subsequent statements further corroborated investigative leads, confirming involvement in a series of killings spanning more than a decade. Kohlhepp was detained immediately after the rescue of the captive woman, and early interview sessions yielded voluntary admissions detailing multiple homicides. His descriptions aligned with documented evidence from prior unsolved investigations, including timelines, victim names, and methods previously unconfirmed by law enforcement. These interviews accelerated case consolidation as detectives verified details across crime scenes, linking him definitively to 7 murders. He pled guilty in 2017 and received 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, formally closing cases that had remained unresolved for years. Public review following the sentencing focused on systemic gaps in sex offender monitoring, questions surrounding firearm access despite past convictions, and the extended duration in which Kohlhepp operated without detection. The revelations prompted calls for strengthened oversight mechanisms and renewed scrutiny of background check standards for professional licensing and weapons procurement. Case 5. January 18, 2015, Stanford University. A 22-year-old unconscious woman was found behind a dumpster near a fraternity house, and responding officers immediately focused on a 19-year-old student-athlete detained at the scene. As emergency personnel evaluated the victim's condition, early statements and witness observations established the suspect's proximity and behavior, prompting rapid escalation from a medical response to a felony sexual assault investigation. 2 graduate students cycling nearby witnessed part of the assault, intervened, and restrained the suspect when he attempted to flee. They contacted police, guided officers to the location, and provided first-hand accounts of the events leading to his detention. Medical examination at the hospital confirmed multiple indicators consistent with sexual assault, including trauma and impaired consciousness. The victim, unresponsive at the scene due to intoxication, was unable to provide an immediate narrative, making physical evidence, witness intervention, and time-stamped observations central to the early investigative record. The victim was an adult visitor attending a campus party with her sister, unfamiliar with campus social environments, and unaware of the suspect prior to the incident. Turner was a first-year student and competitive swimmer, whose athletic profile and personal background were repeatedly highlighted in media coverage and courtroom arguments. Defense and prosecution narratives contrasted sharply, with the victim's vulnerability emphasized against Turner's academic and athletic standing, shaping public perception of the case long before trial proceedings concluded. Physical evidence included biological samples, photographs, and environmental forensic analysis, documenting the location and sequence of events. Witness accounts from the intervening students aligned with time logs, bike path activity, and the suspect's own admissions regarding alcohol consumption and interaction with the victim. Blood alcohol concentration levels for both parties established significant impairment, reducing ambiguity regarding consent and physical capacity. These combined elements formed a detailed evidentiary timeline that left little factual dispute over the assault sequence, instead shifting legal argument toward interpretation of intent and incapacitation. Turner was arrested at the scene and subsequently charged with multiple felony counts, including assault with intent to commit rape and sexual penetration of an unconscious person. The case advanced to a 2016 jury trial in which prosecutors argued that the victim's incapacitation rendered any claim of consent invalid. Testimony from the witnesses, forensic experts, and law enforcement reinforced the prosecution's narrative, leading to Turner's conviction on all counts. The proceedings underscored complexities surrounding college drinking culture, consent standards, and the credibility challenges faced by incapacitated victims. A 6-month jail sentence with early release for good behavior prompted national outrage, sparking widespread criticism of judicial discretion and perceived leniency. Public reaction fueled a successful campaign to recall the presiding judge and contributed to legislative reforms tightening sentencing guidelines for sexual assault involving intoxicated or unconscious victims. The Victims' Impact Statement, released publicly, became a central document in national discussions on survivor advocacy, institutional responsibility, and criminal justice disparities. Case 6. 2016, Michigan. Allegations against a national gymnastics physician emerged publicly, and early reports triggered an investigation that quickly uncovered extensive abuse carried out under the guise of medical treatment. As survivor accounts grew, the case exposed how long-standing authority, institutional trust, and procedural oversight failures enabled misconduct to persist across multiple organizations connected to elite athletics. Media exposure in September 2016 prompted dozens of athletes to come forward, many describing nearly identical encounters spanning years of treatment. Federal and state agencies initiated parallel inquiries, gathering statements from minors, collegiate athletes, and Olympians whose earlier complaints had gone unresolved. The volume and consistency of disclosures signaled systemic issues rather than isolated incidents. Investigators broadened their scope to include training centers, university clinics, and competition venues, compiling a detailed pattern of conduct that contradicted claims of legitimate medical procedure. Victims included children, adolescents, and world-class gymnasts who received treatment during university appointments, national team camps, and international events. Many were accompanied by coaches or parents who relied heavily on Nassar's professional status and long-standing reputation. Institutional settings ranged from Michigan State University athletics facilities to USA Gymnastics training centers, allowing him access to athletes across multiple tiers of competition. These environments reinforced a perception of safety and authority that shielded abusive behavior and made detection significantly more difficult for those unfamiliar with proper medical boundaries. The investigation incorporated survivor testimony, expert medical reviews, and assessments of procedural compliance within affiliated institutions. Digital evidence, including illicit material recovered from Nassar's devices, further corroborated allegations and expanded the scope of criminal charges. FBI findings highlighted delays in earlier reporting pathways and gaps in institutional responses, revealing missed opportunities for intervention. Revi. WS of complaint histories documented instances where concerns had been raised but not escalated, contributing to national scrutiny of internal reporting systems. Nassar pled guilty to federal charges involving illicit materials, receiving initial sentencing before facing additional state-level prosecutions. Subsequent hearings produced convictions on counts of criminal sexual conduct tied directly to athlete testimonies. Judges issued lengthy consecutive sentences that effectively ensured lifetime incarceration. The combined proceedings drew widespread public attention and prompted reevaluation of how medical authority can be exploited within competitive sports settings. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the U.S. Olympic Committee faced extensive civil litigation, resulting in major settlements, organizational resignations, and bankruptcy proceedings. Public review concentrated on structural failures surrounding athlete protection, mandatory reporting obligations, and oversight mechanisms within youth and elite athletic programs. Legislative reforms followed, strengthening safeguarding policies, increasing institutional accountability, and expanding legal requirements for reporting suspected abuse across national athletic organizations. Case 7, 1985-2007, Los Angeles. A series of women were found murdered across South Central, their cases initially treated as isolated incidents before later review linked them to a single long-operating offender. The extended timeline, spanning more than 2 decades, allowed the perpetrator to evade detection as investigators pieced together patterns that had gone unrecognized during earlier waves of violence. Early homicide patterns began emerging in the mid-1980s, marked by victims found in alleys, abandoned lots, or secluded residential areas. The frequency of incidents slowed in the late 1980s and 1990s, leading to the appearance of a prolonged gap that complicated investigative continuity. When similar cases resurfaced in the early 2000s, law enforcement reassessed prior files and reactivated task force operations. Renewed analytical reviews highlighted consistencies in victim type, location profiles, and ballistic evidence, reinforcing the likelihood that a single offender had resumed activity after years of apparent inactivity. Victims were predominantly marginalized women from underserved communities in South Central Los Angeles, many facing socioeconomic instability, limited access to support services, or transient living conditions. The vulnerability of these populations contributed to slower case traction and reduced public awareness. Franklin lived within the same neighborhoods, maintaining a familiar local presence while working in municipal sanitation and later performing on repair jobs. His everyday interactions and stable work history enabled him to blend seamlessly into the environment where the murders occurred, minimizing suspicion among both residents and investigators. A major investigative shift occurred in 2010 when familial DNA testing matched crime scene material to a relative of Franklin's son. This breakthrough allowed detectives to pursue covert sample collection from Franklin himself. Surveillance teams obtained discarded items containing genetic material, which laboratory tests confirmed as direct matches to evidence recovered from multiple homicide scenes dating back decades. The use of familial DNA marked a significant advancement in the case, transforming a stagnant investigation into a prosecutable sequence of linked crimes. Franklin was arrested in 2010 and charged with 10 murders and 1 attempted murder, with oversight teams searching his residence for corroborating evidence. Investigators recovered photographs, personal items belonging to unidentified women, and objects consistent with victim timelines. Physical evidence strengthened connections established through DNA analysis, providing a comprehensive basis for prosecution. The arrest concluded one of the region's longest-running serial murder investigations and provided answers to families who had waited years for resolution. He was convicted in 2016 and received a death sentence, formally acknowledging decades of harm inflicted on communities with limited institutional support. Franklin died in custody in 2020 while awaiting execution. The case prompted national discussions about disparities in victim recognition, investigative prioritization, and the historical lack of resources allocated to cases involving marginalized populations. It also underscored the evolving role of forensic technology in addressing long-standing investigative gaps. Case 8. November 27, 2015, Colorado Springs, Colorado. A gunman opened fire at a Planned Parenthood clinic, killing multiple people and triggering an hours-long armed confrontation before being taken into custody. As responding teams attempted to evacuate civilians and secure the perimeter, the incident rapidly escalated into one of the region's most violent attacks on a medical facility, providing reproductive health services. Shots were fired both inside and outside the clinic during regular business hours, striking civilians, employees, and law enforcement officers attempting to reach wounded victims. The suspect moved between rooms and sightlines, forcing officers to establish containment zones while negotiating active gunfire. Nearby businesses and medical facilities initiated lockdown procedures as patrol units diverted traffic and tactical teams advanced. Multiple casualties were confirmed early in the response, underscoring the volatility of the situation as SWAT personnel gained incremental control of the surrounding area. Victims included clinic staff members providing routine care, patients present for scheduled appointments, and first responders who attempted to approach the building under fire. Deer lived in a remote rural area and had a long history of erratic behavior, sporadic employment, and strained interpersonal relationships. Prior police encounters documented disruptive conduct, contributing to a portrait of instability that aligned with statements from former neighbors and acquaintances. The contrast between his isolated lifestyle and the urban clinic setting intensified questions about motive and psychological state. Statements made by Deer following his arrest reflected disorganized thought patterns and a mixture of ideological references, prompting prosecutors to request comprehensive psychiatric evaluations. Mental health experts reviewed his verbal responses, behavioral history, and recorded interviews to assess functional capacity. Inconsistencies in his reasoning and cognitive presentation raised concerns about his ability to understand the proceedings or assist in his defense, shifting the investigation's emphasis toward competency determinations rather than traditional motive reconstruction. Deer surrendered after prolonged negotiation and was formally charged with multiple homicide and attempted homicide counts. However, successive judicial reviews concluded that he was incompetent to stand trial, citing persistent mental health impairments that prevented meaningful participation in legal proceedings. These rulings suspended forward movement on criminal prosecution, placing the case under continued clinical and judicial monitoring rather than advancing toward a jury trial. Deer remained confined in a state mental health facility, with no completed trial or sentencing phase to resolve criminal accountability. The absence of adjudication raised complex questions surrounding competency standards, long-term confinement authority, and the balance between due process and public safety. Families of victims and survivors expressed ongoing frustration with the open-ended status of the case, reflecting broader national debates over mental health treatment, ideologically motivated violence, and gaps in resolution for those affected by mass casualty incidents. Case 9. September 23, 2016, Burlington, Washington. A 20-year-old gunman opened fire inside the Macy's department store at Cascade Mall, killing multiple victims and fleeing the scene before police arrived. Initial confusion during evacuation complicated early response efforts as investigators began tracing the movements of the unidentified suspect caught briefly on interior cameras. 911 callers reported rapid gunfire erupting inside the women's clothing section shortly before closing hours, prompting an immediate multi-agency mobilization. Responders arriving at the mall found 5 victims fatally wounded and evidence suggesting the shooter had exited within minutes of the attack. Officers worked to secure the large commercial complex, clear remaining civilians, and collect early shell casing and trajectory data. The abruptness of the incident and lack of direct eyewitness identification increased reliance on surveillance footage to reconstruct the attacker's path through the store. Victims were civilians shopping near the end of the business day, representing a range of ages and backgrounds common to evening mall traffic. Cetin had a documented history involving domestic violence incidents and court directives, including an order to surrender firearms that had not been fully enforced. Records reflected instability in personal relationships and interactions with law enforcement, contributing to contextual assessments once his identity emerged. The contrast between his documented behavioral concerns and the public nature of the attack intensified scrutiny over earlier intervention opportunities. Surveillance images released to the public showed a clear view of the suspect entering the store, enabling rapid crowdsourced tips. Vehicle information, address records, and prior law enforcement contacts helped narrow investigative focus. Detectives assembled a profile within 24 hours through coordinated reviews of digital evidence, witness statements, and background. Reports. The decisive combination of video footage and administrative records produced a near-immediate identification, allowing police to shift from evidence processing to targeted apprehension. Cetin was located and arrested in Oak Harbor the following evening without resistance. Officers transported him to county custody, where he was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Interviews and searches pursued potential ideological or interpersonal motives, but early indications suggested no broader network or accomplice involvement. The arrest brought rapid closure to the manhunt phase, though many investigative questions remained unresolved. He died by suicide in jail months later, terminating the legal process before trial, testimony, or formal sentencing could occur. The absence of courtroom proceedings left no definitive motive on record and limited public insight into the attack's underlying causes. His death prompted procedural reviews of inmate monitoring and highlighted broader issues surrounding firearm enforcement failures, behavioral red flags, and challenges in preventing impulsive public venue attacks. Case 10. February 20, 2016, Kalamazoo, Michigan. 6 people were killed across multiple locations during a night of random shootings, and investigators soon identified a 45-year-old Uber driver as the sole suspect. The attacks unfolded over several hours, creating widespread fear as authorities attempted to track a moving gunman whose identity was initially unknown. Gunfire first erupted at an apartment complex, where initial victims were shot in a residential parking area. Hours later, additional shootings occurred at a car dealership and a restaurant parking lot, each location producing more casualties with no apparent connection among the victims. During this period, Dalton continued transporting Uber passengers, completing ride requests in between attacks and leaving riders unaware of the unfolding violence. The extended timeline and shifting locations complicated early response efforts, prompting police to issue urgent public warnings as they attempted to contain the threat. Victims were unrelated civilians conducting routine activities in public spaces, including families, bystanders, and individuals visiting local businesses. Dalton had no prior violent criminal record and worked in insurance before supplementing his income with rideshare driving. Background information revealed little that aligned with typical markers of targeted violence, making the randomness of the attacks especially alarming. His outwardly unremarkable profile contrasted starkly with the severity and unpredictability of the shooting sequence. Investigators relied on witness accounts, surveillance footage, and ballistic comparisons to reconstruct the timeline across all 3 scenes. Shell casing analyses linked the shootings to a single firearm, while interviews with Uber passengers helped establish Dalton's location during key intervals. The absence of ideological statements, target patterns, or personal links led authorities to rule out political or extremist motives. Reconstruction efforts highlighted the rapid but disjointed progression of attacks, underscoring the challenges posed by mobile offenders. Police apprehended Dalton without resistance after locating his vehicle and conducting a controlled stop. During questioning, he made statements referencing psychological disturbances and beliefs that the Uber app was influencing his behavior, though evaluators found no coherent ideological framework. His remarks complicated assessments of mental state, but did not negate the extensive evidence establishing his culpability. The arrest ended a night of widespread alarm and enabled investigators to begin preparing a consolidated case. Dalton pled guilty in 2019 to all counts of murder and attempted murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His decision to forego trial left many motive questions unresolved, adding to public debate surrounding the unpredictability of mass violence in individuals without prior criminal histories. The case reinforced concerns about detection challenges, gaps in behavioral warning signs, and the complexities of assessing risk among otherwise routine community members.